Despite the rapid development of science and medicine, the man of today dances with the devil every day. We do not fear getting sick again, for instance, with the usual flu, because we'll have to take medication for just a few days and be out and about again soon. However, the reason for this carelessness is simple. We know too little and rarely think about the fact that there are the most dangerous and deadly diseases in the world that can be conditionally called dormant. Their peculiarity lies in the fact that they cannot manifest themselves for decades, but then, for some reason, break free and cause significant harm to humans and the environment. And although such diseases rarely provoke large-scale epidemics, when such infections reappear among people, this leads to tension in society, especially if they're perceived as a powerful biological weapon in the hands of both nature and humans. For many of us, the very phrase Siberian plague, its official name in the scientific world is anthrax, strikes real terror. This is despite the fact that the disease is not one that really threatens humanity and the existence of life on Earth, but its outbreaks are justly feared because they can periodically occur, and quite unexpectedly, anywhere on the planet. And if we do not realize that we deal with anthrax in time, we have to prepare for serious consequences. Anthrax, which means coal or carbuncle in Greek, is carried by the bacterium Bacillus anthracis. It is an Rg2 biological agent, that is, it is the causative agent of very contagious epidemic disease. The name of the disease was given by the coal-black color of the skin scab. It has been known since ancient times as Persian or sacred fire. More than once, scientists and writers of the ancient world in the East wrote about the disease, and not at all as an ordinary one. It was described as something terrible and bringing death to both animals and people. Anthrax was sometimes even called one of the 10 plagues of Egypt, implying the massive death of livestock. The source of infection is wild animals, cattle, horses, sheep, goats, deer, rarely pigs, and domestic animals. The moment of infection occurs when they consume grass or hay infected with anthrax spores, drink water in which they are present, or an insect bites them. Then the already infected animal releases the pathogen into the environment together with urine or feces. In most cases, anthrax in animals proceeds very quickly and ends with a die-off, single or massive. The latent period of the disease ranges from several days to 2 to 3 weeks and is characterized by severe fever, disturbed activity of the cardiovascular system, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea. Usually, the animal dies in agony within 2 to 3 days. The chronic form can last for several months, but even then, there is no guarantee that the animal survives. To tell the truth, hardly anybody would dare to keep it in the herd after that and consume milk or meat from the cattle who had contracted anthrax previously. In its texture, Bacillus anthracis is a very large bacillus that is easily destroyed by high temperatures or disinfection. But the main problem is that when interacting with oxygen, the bacillus forms spores, and they are highly resistant to most external factors. For example, under direct sunlight they can stay alive for 10 to 15 days. Only dry heat at a temperature not lower than 140 degrees Celsius can kill the spores, and even that can be done no faster than in 3 hours. Few organisms have that kind of endurance. It is not surprising that the infection can sleep quietly on pastures or in places of burial of livestock for decades. Nothing threatens its existence. The soil in such places is heavily infected with the secretions of animals suffering from anthrax. These are the primary foci of the disease, and the secondary ones appear after the spores are washed away by rain or meltwater. Often it is this factor that causes the spread of the disease. And humans are also to blame. According to sanitary standards, it is forbidden to remove soil within a radius of 500 to 600 meters near the existing places of burial of livestock, especially with proven infection with anthrax. Although, let's imagine an ordinary poor farmer for whom every plot of land is of great importance. Will he comply with the norms if he or she needs to feed his or her family every day? This phenomenon is most common in the poorest countries of Africa and Asia, where anthrax is now among the relatively common diseases. A person can become infected with anthrax through direct contact with an animal, when slaughtering livestock or butchering a carcass, caring for a sick pet on a farm, or even just touching animal products, hides, skins, or furs. Also, anthrax spores can enter our bodies through meat and other innards. Infection through horsefly bites and inhalation of infected dust is not excluded, but such cases are rare. Once in the body, the anthrax bacillus releases exotoxin, which leads to the intoxication of the body and the appearance of abscesses on the skin and lymphatics. What are the first signs and symptoms of anthrax in humans? Let's start with the fact that the disease affects different organs and, depending on this, the degree of its severity is manifested. More than 90% of all cases are cutaneous anthrax, having a very low mortality rate. If it is detected in time, according to various estimates, no more than 10 to 20% of patients die without treatment. The disease appears 2 to 5 days after contact with anthrax spores. With this type of disease, boils appear on the skin, gradually turning into an ulcer with a black dot in the center, a scab. Most often, these lesions do not cause pain, although the lymph nodes can be disturbing. Usually, spores enter the body through cuts on the skin of a person who often comes into contact with animals, for example, on a farm. An important factor, since the disease is limited to the skin, deadly bacilli rarely enter the bloodstream. When timely medical care is provided, they do not cause much harm to health, although the course of the treatment can be long, up to 6 weeks or more. But it is especially difficult for patients whose carbuncles are concentrated in the head, neck, and mucous membranes of the mouth and nose. As a rule, there is only one lesion, but there are cases when there are 10 to 20 of them on the body, which of course hindered the treatment. It is much worse if anthrax has entered the lungs. This phenomenon is rare, but such cases also happen. In such a situation, the bacillus first infects the lymph nodes in the chest. Fluid accumulates in it, and the person first has severe shortness of breath, cough, and then chills and a general breakdown. Because of this, inhalational anthrax can be confused with the common flu, which is sometimes a deadly mistake. Since the patient is taking a conventional cold remedy, such treatment is not successful. Pneumonia occurs, and it may end up in death within 2 to 3 days. With the late start of treatment, the mortality rate from this type of anthrax is over 85%, with an early start about 45%. The bacillus can also penetrate the human gastrointestinal tract. The reason is the consumption of infected meat, and the symptoms are sharp pains in the abdomen, vomiting, and diarrhea, sometimes with blood. From the stomach, the bacillus enters the bloodstream and actively distributes toxins. The probability of death in this situation is from 25 to 60%, depending on how soon the diagnosis is made and treatment begins. The remarkable thing is that the pulmonary and intestinal forms are not transmitted from person to person. Finally, the septical form of anthrax is the most dangerous. With it, there are blood disorders, for example, coagulation failure. The kidneys may fail, the body temperature may drop below normal, and infectious toxic shock begins. The lungs swell. Peritonitis can occur in the intestines, that is, pus accumulates, and there is a 90% death probability as early as in the first days of the disease progression. If it is accompanied by meningitis, that is, brain damage, there is no chance of survival. For a long time, doctors could not classify anthrax in its clinical presentation, although outbreaks of anthrax occurred in different regions of the planet from time to time. Animals, and then people, died in tens of thousands, but no one even theoretically managed to guess what was the cause of such a terrible pestilence, and even more so, what to do with an incomprehensible disease and how to treat it. Specific shifts in anthrax recognition were recorded as late as the 18th century in France. In 1737, the local surgeon Dumel described a case of malignant abscesses in a butcher who, after butchering an ox carcass, picked his mouth with the same knife. Well, personal hygiene in Europe was very bad back then. The same doctor noted an episode when his colleague contracted anthrax after cutting a patient's carbuncle, without observing appropriate security measures. Anthrax was first reliably described in 1766 by the French surgeon Sauveur-François Morand. By that time, the disease was already widely known both in his homeland, where they often talked about harmful plains and cursed fields, and in Hungary and Germany. As far as Haiti was concerned, 15,000 people died from an anthrax epidemic in 1770. The local population was in a panic. The disease manifested itself unexpectedly and rapidly, and neither the doctors nor the sorcerers, who also died from an unknown disease, knew how to combat it. Not even the famous shamanic rituals helped. By the way, it's time to explain why this infection is often also called the Siberian plague. The fact is that the first serious encounter with an already detected but not yet fully understood disease occurred precisely in the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century. The city of Chelyabinsk in the Urals, Siberia, which is the actual border between Europe and Asia, was under attack. For unknown reasons, blisters and scabs began to appear on the skin of the people there. Many deaths were recorded. Chaos broke out in the city. In 1786, the best physicians of Russia were sent to Chelyabinsk under the guidance of Stepan Andreevsky and his assistant Vasily Zhukovsky. At first, they assumed that the ulcers on the bodies of infected people appeared due to insect bites or poor water quality, but these versions were not confirmed. Andreevsky performed an autopsy of more than 200 corpses of animals and people, studying the pathological changes of anthrax. But even after that, he could not understand the nature of the disease. When, a year later, the cause of the illness of the local residents was still not established, Andreevsky, for the first time in the history of medicine, decided to infect himself with anthrax. How self-sacrificing the doctors were then, weren't they? Injecting himself with the liquid from the carbuncle of a dead animal. And then, for several months, under the supervision of Zhukovsky, he made the case record of his own illness. At the beginning of the observations, the scientist had hallucinations. He felt very bad, but did not stop. As a result, it was found that the course of the disease is the same for animals and humans, and is transmitted from the former to the latter. The doctors also developed the first measures to prevent anthrax, which are still relevant today. Andreevsky later described the disease in his work A Short History of Anthrax, 1796. But the main thing is that the doctor did all of this long before the causative agent of the disease was discovered. It happened only in the 19th century. In 1838, the French veterinarian Onesime Delafond, once again conducting research under a microscope, was the first to identify anthrax bacilli in animals. Later, in 1850, his compatriots Dewayne and Ray discovered them in sheep, and in 1855, the German scientist Alois Pollander found them in cattle. The process of understanding the nature of anthrax has noticeably accelerated, and in its pure form, the anthrax bacillus, the first pathogenic bacteria for humans, was isolated in 1876 by another famous German scientist, Robert Koch. Diagnosing anthrax in modern conditions for infectious disease physicians is a simple task, and is carried out using a series of rapid smear tests, PCR tests, and the study of bacteria that are extracted from the carbuncles, blood, sputum, or feces of the patient. If the lungs are affected, doctors prescribe a CT scan, and if there are signs of meningitis, altered state of consciousness, and mental disorders, then a lumbar puncture, recovery of liquid from the spinal cord. The sooner the disease is detected and its form is determined, the more chances a person has to survive in this deadly fight. In the treatment, an abundant introduction of intravenous antibiotics, specific immunoglobulins, and a number of other medicines is used. By the way, the common penicillin is still one of the worst enemies of anthrax. In the United States, monoclonal antibodies, raxibacumab, are additionally used to treat the pulmonary form in adults and children. Efficiency is proven. Patients are cured much faster. As for the prevention of the disease, it is recommended for people who are professionally associated with animal husbandry or processing animal hides, for example, workers in textile factories. This is a 2-time inoculation with a live vaccine, followed by annual revaccination. And of course, we must not forget to vaccinate livestock against the disease. For this, live spore vaccines are used, which provide immunity for 12 months. By the way, an interesting fact: products made of wool and fur infected with anthrax spores can be disinfected in special chambers with formaldehyde vapors, especially valuable fur, with methyl bromide. But if you know for sure that these things bring such mortal danger, are there really those who want to wear them? You may be surprised, but yes, because often people are sorry to part with things for which they once paid money. It is the nature of many of us to risk health and life for material possessions. As practice shows, people who have been ill with anthrax acquire strong immunity to it. Although there have been cases in world history when a disease came to a person again after 10 to 20 years, the relapse was no longer accompanied by severe symptoms. There is also a version that cutaneous anthrax does not give immunity, especially if the method of early antibacterial intervention was used. I will note an important feature. The corpses of people who lost the fight against anthrax are usually not dissected, only in the most extreme cases. It is allowed to bury the dead in public cemeteries, but in, so to speak, a special ritual, having coffined the body in a tight wrapping. And if there was an autopsy, a thick layer of dry bleach is poured into the bottom of the coffin, otherwise the infection can penetrate the soil and be free again. In recent years, there have been many attempts to develop new medicines against anthrax, but this is not urgently needed, because existing ones are still effective. However, vaccination still plays a huge role in the fight against any infectious disease. Authoritative world-famous scientists have been developing a vaccine against anthrax since the 19th century, but their attempts failed for a long time. There were not enough facts, facilities, or evidence. Until Louis Pasteur himself, the legendary French chemist and microbiologist, got down to business, it can be said that it was the development of the anthrax vaccine that his career in the academic community was built on. In 1880, he published a scientific article, "The Anthrax Vaccine Was Still Under Development," in which he took the risk to assume that anthrax could be weakened using the same method that was used in the fight against the chicken cholera epidemic, namely, when the microbe was killed by the airborne oxygen. There were many opponents to this idea, and the main antagonist was the no less famous veterinarian and publisher Hippolyte Rossignol, who doubted the microbiological nature of any disease. In May 1881, he offered Pasteur a kind of bet to conduct a public experiment on a farm in Puy-le-Fort, and even expressed his willingness to provide a herd of animals for the experiment. Pasteur agreed to these terms of the dispute, but urgently withdrew his assistants Émile Roux and Charles Chamberlain from leave. That was a least evil solution. By that time, it became obvious that oxygen does not help to destroy anthrax spores, and the great scientist did not want to lose. In the process of preparing for the experiment, Émile Roux managed to find out that at the same time, Jean-Joseph Toussaint, a professor at the Veterinary Academy in Toulouse, was independently developing an anthrax vaccine using carbolic acid as the main ingredient. Pasteur and his assistants had no choice, so the decision came instantly. They went to Puy-le-Fort with a medicine whose effect was poorly understood at that time. To implement the experiment, Pasteur was given 60 cows and sheep. Half of them were given several pre-vaccinations by a microbiologist, and then all animals were injected with a strain of anthrax. The experiment took place in the presence of other scientists, and they were warned soon the unvaccinated animals would be dead, and within about 48 hours. The public closely followed the experiment, recording literally every step of the scientists and animals. Bottom line, all vaccinated cows and sheep remained healthy, while unvaccinated ones died. Of course, this caused a huge resonance in the scientific community. The entire world press wrote about Pasteur's success. His method of vaccination was recognized and called the conversion of non-believers into microbiology. Pasteur was awarded the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor for services in medicine, and his assistants Roux and Chamberlain became holders of this award. By 1894, about 3.5 million sheep were vaccinated throughout France. Animals began to die much less frequently, which allowed this country to become a leader in agricultural production. Then the initiative was taken over by other European states, and animal husbandry ceased to suffer losses because of the spread of anthrax. There were, of course, isolated cases, but, as they say, one cannot do without residual effect. And for those who like interesting facts, I will tell you a very revealing and at the same time curious story about anthrax. In his time, the outstanding Russian microbiologist Nobel Prize winner Ilya Mechnikov was engaged in its study, but his ideas, for various reasons, did not resonate with the scientific community. When the scientist was working in Paris, he had a conflict with a local nobleman. He challenged Mechnikov and offered to choose a weapon. The scientist chose 2 test tubes, one with plain water and the other with anthrax bacteria. Knowing what kind of illness it was, the Frenchman preferred to abruptly cancel the duel. As you can see, sometimes medicine is stronger than any weapon. At the same time, scientists have always wondered how anthrax could spread so widely around the globe at all. After all, this disease really occurred in almost all regions of the planet. The main question was that anthrax is a disease that proceeds quite quickly. That is, animals infected with it were not able to travel long distances and carry the infection. This means that if there were anthrax epidemics in the world, they must have been local. Although in reality, the disease trod the earth unhindered, as scientists and historians found out millennia ago. According to one hypothesis, it really originated in Siberia, when areas of permafrost thawed due to abnormally hot weather. Beneath it, the remains of reindeer affected by anthrax were. And spores, as I've already noted, can be dormant for many years. It's hard to say for how long exactly. Usually it's about 10 years, but I'm not sure that this statement has been proven by proper scientific research, said Talima Pearson, an employee at Northern Arizona University, USA. According to him, the bacteria of the genus B. anthracis are very similar at the genetic level, which has slowed down the process of studying them and how they have evolved. It's like trying to tell twins apart. But the scientists, with the help of modern technology, were eventually able to detect some genetic differences between versions of the infection. In particular, a 2004 study showed that the bacillus is divided into 3 main groups. They have a common ancestor, but which of the strains was the first has not been found out so far. The Group A strain can now be found on every continent and is found in approximately 85% of patients worldwide. So a logical question arises. How could it travel such distances by itself or not by itself? Another scientist, Martin Hugh Jones from Louisiana State University, USA, believes that Africa should be considered the birthplace of anthrax. His version is based on the fact that in the south of this continent, the soil contains a lot of the genetic material of this disease. What more evidence do you need? But Talima Pearson strongly disagrees with his colleague. He took part in a research program in the Republic of South Africa to study anthrax. He made a conclusion. Many large herbivores live in this area, and hypothetically, in the process of migration, they could carry a deadly bacterium throughout Africa. At the same time, the scientist notes, animals most likely have nothing to do with the spread of the disease. During the research, it was found that anthrax strains belonging to certain groups are concentrated in certain places, Pearson said. No wonder. Infected animals and people usually died very quickly and did not have time, so to speak, to scatter far across the territory. That is, most likely, it is necessary to speak about the localization of anthrax, at least in the example of southern Africa. Is it logical? Perhaps, But then there's a paradox. In Eurasia, a number of strains of anthrax have a much larger distribution area, which means that the disease has traveled not just long, but very remote distances. But how? Talima Pearson suggested that it was all about the behavior and habits of humans, not animals. It's no secret that our ancestors killed animals for food and skin, or took it off a dead one, so as not to freeze in cold climates. They could well contain anthrax spores, which people intensively carried across the territory of Eurasia. In southern Africa, the climate was much milder. Animal skins were valued less. Therefore, in this region, anthrax bacteria remained in the traditional habitat. Say that was the case, but how can be explained the fact that in North America, anthrax strains are distributed so unevenly? For a long time, it was believed that they were brought here by European colonialists. But then studies showed that this version is unlikely. The fact is that the earliest forms of anthrax were found in the northwestern part of the continent, and the later ones in the south, reaching the state of Texas. That is, logically speaking, the disease entered the territory of the modern United States through Canada and Alaska, from where it went deep into the continent. But the fact is that immigrants from Europe landed on the east coast of North America, and then we can assume that the spread of anthrax is the work of the indigenous population of the mainland, who came here about 13,000 years ago from Asia. It also suggests that the disease was carried by people back in those days, when they were engaged not in agriculture, but in hunting and foraging. So the real path of anthrax was as follows: Asia, Eurasia, North America, South America. In 2007, a group of scientists conducted a global study on bee anthracis distribution history. It turned out that 6,500 to 3,300 years ago, strain A dramatically increased its activity. This period coincides with the Bronze Age and the wide development of trade in Eurasia. Besides, just then, livestock products became a popular topic, including when it came to exchanging for weapons or means of production. For example, a study of anthrax in China showed that most bacilli are found in the soil in the west of the country, where the famous Great Silk Road ran. Probably it became a direct road for the spread of anthrax in other territories at that time. We will not deny the theory. In the 20th century, this bacterium, resistant to external factors, drew the attention of the military, law enforcement agencies, and intelligence. Just at that moment, trends appeared in the world towards the development of biological weapons and their testing. Anthrax was almost ideal for these purposes because it had a deadly effect, while many other infections were a long way off. But even this was not enough for the military, so the spores of the bacillus were repeatedly modified, adding different genes to it and instilling a resistance to strong and effective antibiotics known at that time. The world leaders in the development of biological weapons in those days were the United States, the USSR, Great Britain, and Japan. Although the 1925 Geneva Convention prohibited the use of weapons of mass destruction, no one imposed a veto on scientific experiments. By the way, the same thing happened in 1975, when the Biological Weapons Convention came into force. The leading states of the planet continued to develop it. The motivation was as follows: even if it's officially impossible to develop such a weapon, if the enemy is secretly doing it and we fall behind, we will lose this great bacteriological battle in the end. Probably there was a rational kernel in this, considering what a turbulent situation was then in the world. Anthrax spores were also used for military purposes. For example, back in the late 1930s, the Japanese army was spraying them in Chinese Manchuria, which it occupied. This was done both as a cruel experiment that the PRC still cannot forgive, and to intimidate the local population, who did not want to live under the invaders. Moreover, Japan continued these, so to speak, studies until it recognized its defeat in World War II. The British Army also took part in experiments with anthrax as a biological weapon. In 1942, they planned to drop a spore bomb on Nazi Germany. Preparations for this sabotage took place on the small island of Grenard in Scotland, which was temporarily turned into a testing ground. But the military and scientists did not know their own strength. The bacillus began to actively spread across the island. It all ended up being simply isolated for decades. In 1986, 280 tons of formaldehyde were used to disinfect Grenard, and only in 1990 quarantine restrictions were lifted from the island. Isolation for half a century. How about that? In the United States, the biological weapons program was officially launched in 1942 by President Franklin Roosevelt. Only during World War II, at least $400 million were allocated for the project, and the amounts further increased. We know that the city of Fort Detrick, Maryland, became the center of the program, and experiments were carried out on volunteers from the American Army at this base. They were especially infected with diseases that could be used as biological weapons, and various vaccines were tested. According to official data, many preparations were invented there, but whether anthrax was among those diseases is not exactly indicated. Although it can be assumed that it was, why is it worse than the rest of the bacteriological weapons? In the USSR, the development of biological weapons began in the beginning of the 20th century, and tests were carried out mainly on prisoners and political detainees. The military and physicians paid much attention to working with anthrax spores. All processes were kept as secret as possible. But in 1979, an emergency occurred at the Sverdlovsk 19 Military Research Center. Anthrax somehow escaped from the lab, killing over 60 people. The authorities claimed that the reason was in the contaminated meat that the locals ate, and a hypothesis was also put forward about the sabotage of foreign intelligence. But in 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin declared, when there was an outbreak of anthrax in Sverdlovsk, the official conclusion said that some kind of dog had brought it, although later the KGB admitted that the reason was the Soviet military developments. But the results of the investigation of this terrible case were never published. For many years, no one remembered anthrax, until a completely terrible story happened in the USA in 2001, which is remembered all over the world today. Shortly after the September 11th tragedy, when a terrorist attack took place in New York, threatening letters and suspicious powder came to 2 senators and to the editorial offices of several newspapers. They turned out to be modified anthrax spores. As a result, the inhalation form of the disease, and it has the highest mortality rate, 22 people were infected, 5 of whom died. For Americans, and not only for them, this event caused a real shock. The cost of securities on the U.S. market collapsed in a matter of days. Panic was growing in the country. They accused radical Islamists from the al-Qaeda movement and personally Osama bin Laden of this terrorist act. According to our sources, they have been looking for an opportunity to buy chemical and biological weapons over the past 10 years. Most likely, the terrorists succeeded. Ben Bradshaw, deputy head of the British Foreign Office, commented on the situation at the time. The FBI has been investigating this high-profile case, which has been called Anthrax, for 7 years. At first, microbiologist Stephen Hatfield was suspected of involvement in the crime. In this regard, he lost his job. The doors to the scientific community were closed for the scientist, but Hatfield was never officially charged. In 2003, he sued the FBI, won the case, and received nearly $6 million for damages. At the same time, the investigation was carried out against another scientist, Bruce Ivins, who worked in the laboratory of the Biological Center of Fort Detrick, familiar name, and was engaged in anthrax research. In 2001, anthrax spores ended up outside the center, but the scientist did not report this to the authorities and, according to him, destroyed them himself. Thus, he became the prime suspect in the Anthrax case. But they did not manage to hand over the suspicion to Ivins. In 2008, the scientist committed suicide. In the 20th century, this was the most high-profile incident associated with the use of anthrax as a biological weapon. Information periodically appears that radical Islamists want to repeat similar terrorist acts, that such weapons are being developed by the dictatorial regime of North Korea. But there is no sufficient evidence of this. However, this does not mean that special services and intelligence do not monitor such moments. Because modern technology, combined with deadly diseases, poses a huge danger to humanity. Unfortunately, everyone has their own idea of what progress is. If we talk about the natural factors in anthrax occurrence, it still occurs throughout the entire planet. But these outbreaks do not remind epidemics. The World Health Organization claims that the number of episodes of the disease per year is between 2,000 and 20,000 cases. Why such a wide range? The reason is simple. Not all states provide complete and reliable statistics on this disease. Moreover, in the 21st century, people have not yet learned how to diagnose anthrax and blame it on other diseases, although this is less often the case. Global monitoring of diseases is becoming stricter each year. Cases of anthrax are recorded in about 80 countries of the world from time to time, and they are most often associated with the livestock sector. In the USA and Canada, such episodes are hardly ever recorded. In Europe, the minimum number of them are. More susceptible to outbreaks are Central and South America, Guatemala, Honduras, Chile, Haiti, Peru. Asia, Syria, India, Turkey. The center and western part of Africa. The last major outbreak of anthrax was during the Rhodesian Civil War in 1978, when the epidemic sickened about 6,500 people, 100 of whom died. As for the animal world, the situation is more complicated in the sense that some areas of the earth are actually affected by anthrax, regardless of the factors of influence of nature or man anymore. For example, the Etosha National Park in Namibia, Africa, where anthrax has long been considered just natural for the environment, to such an extent that any attempt to fight this disease in animals was given up 40 years ago. In 2004, much to our regret, anthrax wiped out about 90% of the wild herbivore population in Malilingwe Wildlife Reserve in Zimbabwe. In 2010, a similar outbreak in Uganda killed more than 80 hippos. That is, both wildlife and reserves sometimes suffer from outbreaks of anthrax. Why does a human not always intervene in such situations? What's stopping us? After all, we're talking about our own safety, not only about nature. The question deserves to be asked. But I still would like to end on a positive note. It turns out that anthrax can be beneficial to humanity. Yes, it sounds at the very least strange, but the scientists from Harvard Medical School, USA, have recently found out, after a series of experiments, that certain toxins isolated from anthrax spores are very effective as painkillers. They published their findings in the journal Nature Neuroscience. Experiments on laboratory mice have shown that a combination of a protective antigen and anthrax protein penetrates the spinal cord and blocks the neurons that signal the body that pain is present. But scientists did not stop there and put another poison inside the antigen, botulinum toxin, which is actually one of the most powerful poisons on the planet, but when used correctly, it acts as an effective pain reliever. A new mixture was introduced to the rodents and showed an even more impressive result. The only thing that scientists were concerned about was, does this mean that anthrax spores are trying to hide from further detection and treatment, having adapted such an ability? Viruses and infections are very smart. This has been repeatedly proven in the process of fighting them, which humanity has not yet fully won. Once again, anthrax is definitely not included in the list of infectious diseases that threaten our existence. Although this does not mean that you can let the disease distribution out of hand, we have been convinced more than once that some diseases can mutate and traditional medicines will be powerless after a while. New ones will have to be developed, and the effect will not always be positive. Anthrax should not be underestimated. For many centuries, it has caused problems for both the animal world and the human inextricably linked with it. Indeed, now it is more or less dormant. It only occasionally breaks out into the outside world. But who knows what might happen tomorrow? By the way, do you have any pets? Perhaps you are a farmer. Do you know if there is an old abandoned cattle cemetery not far from your farm? How safe is it, and how strictly guarded is it? I would advise you to pay attention to these points and always be prepared for the fact that mortal danger may be very close. I don't want to scare you, but it's better to be careful. Sincerely yours, Dr. PopMed.